I spent $35,000 to betray my toxic family and didn't look back. For 15 years, my family meticulously erased me. Secret trips to Ibiza, private expeditions to Antarctica. They thought their systematic exclusion was a non-event, but the silence they created was just the fuel. When I received a massive six-figure bonus, I didn't get angry, I got tactical. I spent $35,000 to buy a private island siege for the only people who ever showed up for me, proving, once and for all, where my true loyalty lies. The explosion from my biological family, it was a disaster I was happy to pay for. Hit that like button if you know what it's like to be the black sheep, and drop a comment below right now, before the video starts, telling me the most disrespectful thing your family ever pulled. Now, let's get into the Chronicle of Victor and the Void. My kinfolk, the primary bloodline, have maintained a rigorous system of exclusion, freezing me out of every major gathering and lavish trick for a decade and a half, so the sheer hysteria they displayed when I finally took an all-expenses-paid, six-figure holiday without their input was truly something to witness. At 32, I am the black hole of my family's social universe, and every year they execute gargantuan voyages, such as commandeering a private island resort off the coast of Ibiza, or embarking on a bespoke Antarctic expedition, all managed via a group-encrypted chat called the Core Ascendancy, from which I am excluded and blocked. I only learned about the Ibiza trip when my mother posted a filtered photo on her private media feed captioned "The Perfect Unblemished Family Unit," with the audacious lie that Victor was tied up with a critical project at work when a distant acquaintance inquired about my whereabouts. This chilling pattern of erasure has been operative since I was a teenager, with excuses for not including me on a chartered sailboat through the Aegean Sea or a safari in the Serengeti, ranging from sudden mechanical failures to simply miscounting the available seats on the private jet and simply forgot to correct the manifest. However, a constant observer, my father's sister, Aunt Serena, a woman of sharp intuition and darker humor, saw the void and started integrating me into all her family's eccentric rituals, with her husband, Greg, treating me like the prodigal son, and their boy, Zane, seeing me as his confidant. When I completed my degree, a specialization in advanced cyberlinguistics, my core family didn't attend, but Serena, Greg, and Zane drove 8 hours in a beat-up pickup truck to watch me accept my diploma. Then, last month, the singularity arrived with my work bonus, a figure so absurd, nearly $35,000, which I instantly liquidated, booking a terrifyingly opulent package to a secluded, nameless atoll in the South Pacific, a sensory siege including an obsidian-walled bunker villa and a submersible. I called Serena and ordered her to submit vacation requests for herself, Greg, and Zane, telling her it was a matter of cosmic rebalancing, and she complied without question. The day before departure, I delivered the travel folios, informing them they were the only family I recognized, and this pilgrimage was non-negotiable. We flew out the next morning, and 3 days into our descent into utter luxury, my phone began to pulse after my brother Lars posted a smug image of their annual planning session for a space tourism package and commented, in response to a cousin's inquiry, that I was too much of a hermit for our kind of excitement. Serena's sister, Valerie, a notorious information broker who was aware of the systematic exclusion, commented that I was currently embedded with Serena's contingent in a private South Pacific atoll. The resulting chaos was magnificent, with my mother attempting contact 15 times and my father sending relentless, accusatory text manifestos claiming I was committing familial treason by subsidizing the leisure of outliers. Lars left a voice message stating that I was a craven sycophant attempting to buy Serena's affection, and Dana messaged asking for the exact cost for her husband's performance review, but I answered none of them. However, when Lars committed an act of staggering idiocy by messaging Serena directly with a vile screed about her being a leech, Serena, with a delighted malicious grin, immediately screenshotted the venom and sent it to me. With a surge of cold, focused rage, I called Lars and, putting him on speakerphone, commanded him to state his grievance, which led to a sputtering tirade about me squandering vast resources while the core ascendancy was struggling to maintain its expected flight path. I simply stated the undeniable reality of their 15-year exclusion, which he tried to cognitively rewrite by claiming I would have soured the atmosphere because I was far too rigid. But I cut him short by asking where he was when Serena drove 8 hours to witness my graduation, a moment he excused by falsely claiming Dana required aid with her archival tax documents that week. He pivoted by accusing me of a targeted assault and flaunting the size of my financial accretion, but I produced a sound that could loosely be defined as a laugh and stated I was directing my resources toward the people who actually tolerate my presence, ending the connection. My mother then sent a chilling text, making my presence at the impending winter solstice gathering conditional on a formal apology to the entire core ascendancy for my deliberately malicious and divisive actions, to which I replied with a concise, brutal hammer blow. Acknowledged. Serena has already issued a more compelling invitation. The remaining duration of the trip was a dreamlike fugue of perfection. Upon our return, my father was waiting for me in the narrow, oppressive hallway outside my apartment door, arms crossed like a pair of iron calipers, wearing the masterful performance of the piously disappointed patriarch he has perfected over 20 years. He launched his verbal projectile, detailing how I had shamed the bloodline and how my juvenile display of spite had caused my mother to require medical intervention. He then followed me into the apartment, commencing a 5-minute-long sermon on loyalty and the inviolable sanctity of the family unit. He then deployed the ultimate tactical deflection, a character assassination of Serena, claiming she had always harbored a pathological jealousy of my mother and had been meticulously engineering my alienation for years, asserting that the entire trip was her Machiavellian plot. I allowed the monologue to reach its crescendo for 5 agonizing minutes, curious to witness the full scope of his self-delusion, before I cut him off mid-syllable, asking with surgical precision, why was I not notified about the Ibiza trip? I pressed him further on the Antarctic, Serengeti, and Aegean Sea trips, and his face performed a mesmerizing, sickening transformation of genuine confusion before he quickly rebooted, switching to the soft excuse protocol, claiming those excursions were dictated by the schedules of others and they simply did not wish to disrupt my sacred process because I was perpetually too involved with work or the pursuit of academic rigor. I produced my phone, scrolling through the archival evidence Serena had provided, showing him screenshots of the core ascendancy chat and my mother's public posts claiming I was at a critical project, when the entire 15-year tapestry of lies organized and cataloged glowed on my screen. His face hardened into a mask of stone, and he executed a final tactical shift, accusing me of being overly dramatic and clinging to meaningless grievances, daring to suggest that they had always assumed I didn't want to attend because I had never formally inquired about the group's whereabouts. I stared at him, my gaze of physical weight, and asked how one inquires about events they have been deliberately kept ignorant of, but he bypassed the logic entirely, claiming I was manufacturing a hostile narrative out of normal family friction, and I told him to vacate the premises as the discussion was terminated. He refused to move, proclaiming we needed to achieve domestic resolution, which in his lexicon meant I would prostrate myself, apologize for my disrespect, and pretend a decade and a half of erasure had been a collective hallucination. I pulled out my phone and called Serena, putting her on speaker right away, and told her my dad was at my place, refusing to leave, asking if Greg could maybe pop by to keep things from getting dramatic. My dad immediately went bright red, totally flipping out, yelling that I was choosing sides and shattering the family's integrity by calling that woman and proving her manipulative designs, before he finally lunged for the door and slammed it so hard the hallway shook. My neighbor, Mrs. Petrova, peeked out, so I just gave her a chill wave and said the architectural anomaly was contained, then locked the door. 20 minutes later, Greg showed up, checked all my locks and windows to make sure they were secure, and even offered to sleep on the sofa as a deterrent, which was a kind, albeit unsettling offer I had to decline. He pulled me into a hug that felt like being crushed by a friendly giant, telling me he was proud of my cold, brutal efficiency in maintaining your boundaries, and I fought hard not to get emotional. That night, I couldn't sleep, stuck in an endless loop of self-doubt, wondering if I had been too harsh. But then I remembered my graduation. My family was celebrating a girlfriend's partner's promotion, while Serena had driven 8 hours for a 30-second handshake, and the agonizing question of my own culpability just disappeared. I finally fell asleep around 4 a.m., only to be dragged awake by my alarm at 7 a.m. As I was making coffee, Lars's phone detonated with a massive, unorganized wall of text accusing me of being a perpetual disruptor and systemic problem, listing evidence from our childhood like the time I cried at Dana's 6th birthday or refused to share my collectible trading cards. He systematically twisted every memory, claiming I was always covetous of my mother's attention, and made all family meals unbearably tense with my silent, critical presence. I read the whole horrifying thing twice, marveling at the deliberate fabrication, and then forwarded the entire toxic cache to Serena. She called me 30 seconds later, and we spent the next hour doing a deep-dive analysis of Lars's manipulative text. Serena, who remembered the raw, unedited context, pointed out every instance of gaslighting, reminding me that at the birthday party, Dana's friends actively mocked my attire, and the toy incident happened right after Lars intentionally vaporized my rarest possession, and I was forced to apologize. Her voice grew hard, a low, dangerous rumble as she progressed through the documents, explaining this was the scapegoat protocol, to blame a single person for all systemic failures. She also mentioned that our cousin Valerie, the information broker, had noticed a sudden spike in public commentary on Lars's social media, with extended family members openly defending me, saying they were perplexed by my consistent absence, which was apparently driving my parents nuts because their busy schedule narrative was collapsing. 2 hours into my workflow, my father's number displayed on my work phone, but it was actually my mother, weeping hysterically, sobbing that I had incited a rebellion and that relatives were demanding explanations for my exclusion, repeating that I was painting them as incompetent custodians. I let her continue her self-pity for a minute, then stated flatly, "I did not turn anyone against you. You accomplished that yourself by maintaining a campaign of deception about my existence for 15 years, before terminating the connection when she tried to argue. For the first time, my feelings were validated by a cold internal logic. I wasn't insane." That afternoon, Lars left a sprawling, excruciating, clearly scripted voicemail, talking about familial clemency and suturing ancient wounds, but never once acknowledging the systemic exclusion or the lies. I texted him back with a single weaponized inquiry. "Were you aware I was not invited to the Ibiza expedition?" He didn't reply for 6 hours, and when he finally did, his text, "Mother stated you had a critical deadline, nothing further," provided that definitive, final data point that he would continue to cling to the self-serving narrative. The following Sunday, I went to Serena's for their traditional dinner, the only stable constant in my turbulent life. Zane was bouncing with excitement, wanting to walk me through all the high-resolution photos he had printed from our Pacific trip, and we spread the archive across the large, scarred dining table, laughing at Greg's severe peeling sunburn. We were halfway through Serena's signature subatomic lasagna when the doorbell rang, and she returned with Valerie, her husband Max, and their 2 children. Valerie, whose presence felt like a low-frequency hum, walked straight to me and gave me a massive conspiratorial hug, whispering that she was delighted I had finally chosen to recalibrate the domestic balance of power with my parents, and that she was morbidly proud that I had seized the moment to expose their theatrical cruelty. Valerie then settled into a chair, announcing that my mother had called her 2 days prior, trying to leverage her into reasoning with the rogue element. But Valerie waved a dismissive hand, stating she had simply corrected my mother's faulty parameters. Valerie told my mother that the only person needing reason was a parent who had systematically erased their own child for 15 years and then got mad when that kid found a substitute family unit. Greg just let out a huge laugh of pure joy, and when Zane asked what systematically meant, Serena explained it as repeating a destructive pattern with cold, calculated intent, which Zane completely understood. Valerie's husband, Max, said he always found my parents' behavior highly perplexing and was glad I had finally initiated a counter-operation. Even their 2 kids nodded along, confirming that the anomalous treatment was obvious to everyone. The quiet that followed felt heavy, and it hit me. These people weren't blood, but they had paid meticulous attention to my life, noticed the exclusion, and cared about it way more than my own parents. Valerie gave my forearm a silent, powerful squeeze, and I had to fight the urge to cry right there. Serena, the emotional tactician, immediately shifted the conversation to the dessert inventory to diffuse the moment. While we were clearing plates, Zane came up to me with this serious look in his intense eyes and asked if I was definitely coming to their house for the winter solstice gathering this year. The commitment hadn't been formally established, so I glanced at Serena and told him I'd be honored to attend, provided the invitation was active. Serena slammed the plate she was holding into the steel basin and spun around, eyes blazing, declaring, "Of course the invitation is active. I have been engineering this reality since you arrived in the driveway." She immediately started a detailed breakdown of the menu, demanding to know my favorite winter cuisine. Greg, in his signature deadpan, joked she'd been planning it since the previous July. Zane started hopping, describing how we could build gingerbread architectural nightmares, and Valerie volunteered her famous sweet potato casserole of existential dread. Suddenly, the entire celebration was terrifyingly operational. Standing there with a stack of dirty plates, I felt like I had finally found the exact resonant frequency of my own life. The next few days were back to the grind. Work, home, and maintaining my phone firewall against my original family. A week after the dinner, my phone buzzed during my lunch break with a text from my mother. I almost ignored the toxic transmission, but curiosity got the best of me. The message stated that they were moving forward with their winter solstice plans without my input, as my choice had been rendered unambiguously clear, with zero admission of guilt or acknowledgement of the 15 years of erasure, just confirmation that the exclusion was now permanent and somehow my fault. I stared at the text, fighting the self-destructive urge to write a sprawling explanation, but instead I sent a 5-character reply, "Got it, enjoy," and put down my phone. An hour later, Serena texted asking if my current emotional state was stable. She clearly had her counterintelligence network active. I replied that I was fine, and her instant response was, "I am extracting you from your professional environment at 5 p.m. Be ready." At the appointed hour, I got into her aggressively modified sedan. She simply squeezed my forearm, offering no advice, just reiterating the only truth that mattered. You have an activated family unit that genuinely desires your presence. We drove to her house, where Greg was cooking something that smelled vaguely of burnt spice, and Zane rushed me with an uncoordinated embrace. Everything felt secure, predictable, and correct. This was the definition of family. Work became a useful, sterile destruction. My department head, Mr. Thorne, a perpetually grim man, even paused by my cubicle one afternoon to mention in his dry, toneless voice that I seemed to carry less mass and was more aggressively focused. I told him I had simply resolved a long-standing, familial systemic error, and he nodded like he was comprehending a complex theorem. Later, I realized Thorne was right. Standing my ground had been a violent psychic struggle, but it had jettisoned a vast, unseen weight. The chronic internal interrogation, "Why did they not want me?" had finally ceased because I knew the answer was not a reflection of my inherent worth. The next morning, I saw Lars's latest broadcast, a grid of filtered photos from the Winter Solstice Planning War Room, showing my mother, father, Lars, and Dana, with Lars even tagging distant cousins not in the photos, leaving me an omitted variable in a display of grotesque artistry. A brief, sharp electric current of pain ran through me, the phantom limb of rejection, but I countered it immediately. These are the same architects of deception who sent me a postcard from Ibiza, the same entities who valued a promotion party over my academic validation. I am now plotting a winter solstice with the people who drove 8 hours just to witness my 30-second handshake with the university president. That weekend, I was back at Serena's, assisting Zane with a new highly ambitious volcano model that required a multi-phase papier-mâché assault. Zane paused, his eyes focused, and asked, low and serious, if he could formally refer to me as his brother instead of his cousin, saying it was the only accurate term. I told him I would be highly honored by the formal upgrade, and he launched at me with startling ferocity, transferring a considerable amount of damped sticky paste onto my person. Serena entered, saw us plastered together, and her eyes immediately became unnervingly moist, saying nothing, but the message was clear. Greg lumbered in, and Zane announced the official reclassification of Victor's familial status. Greg grinned, a cavernous, unsettling display of teeth, declaring, "I knew you were part of the infrastructure." We finished the structural nightmare, ordered a highly dangerous-looking pizza, and the world felt fully aligned. Monday morning, the corporate receptionist called my line, sounding a mix of caution and alarm. Reporting an unauthorized individual was requesting an audience. My father. My stomach contracted into a hard, cold knot, but I took a deep breath and asked if he was initiating a hostile scenario, which she clarified he was calm but aggressively insistent. I instructed her to notify the security detachment and stated, clearer and colder than before, "I will not see him." She confirmed my father was now in the custody of security and asked one final time for a decision, to which I repeated, no. My power, the final absolute boundary, was now fully operational. 10 minutes later, she called back reporting my father had departed, but managed to transfer a handwritten document to the security personnel. I accepted the document, and she arrived moments later, giving me a deep, empathetic pity before returning to her station. I opened the sealed white envelope and read the first line, scrawled in my father's familiar, aggressive script, a masterwork of narcissistic gaslighting. You are surgically destroying your mother's heart and actively destabilizing the family structure. I read no further. I folded the paper, walked to the nearest disposal unit, and deposited the toxic missive into the industrial shredder. I was done accepting their blame for the consequences of their own tactical errors. That weekend, Greg called to ask if I would join him on a fishing reconnaissance mission on Saturday morning. He usually went alone, but felt my presence was required. I've never fished in my life, but I immediately accepted because the invitation felt like a key, a permanent access code to his inner world, beyond the spectacular performative vacations. Saturday morning, I met Greg at a murky reservoir at 6 a.m. It was freezing and foggy, and I was wearing borrowed, ill-fitting clothes from Serena. Greg handed me a questionable liquid in a thermos and didn't comment on my appearance. We headed out, and the lake was silent except for the low engine thrum. We drifted, and Greg started the fishing ritual, patiently demonstrating the archaic art of casting as I repeatedly tangled the line. We sat in a lengthy, comfortable silence until Greg began to narrate a disturbing, fragmented history of my father and Serena's childhood, how Serena, the elder, always deferred leadership to my father, but he was constantly consumed by jealousy when their elders praised her unflappable composure. Greg stated with cold certainty that my father had always been locked in a competitive, self-destructive battle with Serena, constantly seeking validation that he was superior, and suggested that my father had never fully recovered from his parents subtly favoring Serena due to her emotional stability. Greg looked at me and presented the final, chilling hypothesis. Perhaps your parents excluded you because you were a perfect, constant reflection of Serena, or perhaps your very presence and Serena's obvious affection for you triggered a decade-old poisonous core memory in your father's mind. The observation hit me like a ton of bricks because it was the only explanation that rang true. Dana looked exactly like my mother, and Lars was a near-perfect mimic of my father, but I have always been told I am the precise duplicate of Serena, calm, analytical, and a good listener. Perhaps every time they looked at me, they didn't see their son, but their oldest rival. I absorbed the revelation in silence while Greg reeled in a small fish. He didn't press me for a response. We remained on the water until noon, and on the return voyage he simply said, "We will repeat this process next month." The day of collective gratitude, Thanksgiving, arrived, and I spent it at Serena's house, which was a chaotic symphony of human noise and the scent of overcooked meat. Serena initiated a new protocol, a collective declaration of gratitude around the table. When it was my turn, I said I was grateful for the family unit that actively chooses to remain present, and Zane immediately added that he was grateful that I was his newly reclassified brother. Serena started to weep openly into the mashed potatoes and had to temporarily leave the room. Greg applied a reassuring pressure to my knee under the table. The entire day was easy, a rare moment of effortless coexistence. I was not performing a nervous dance around emotional disaster or checking my phone. I was fully present. Later that evening, Valerie sent me a screenshot of a collective message my mother had deployed to the extended family, a sprawling missive about the profound difficulty of the holiday season when certain members abandon their lineage and willfully forget the source of their existence. The message was a thinly veiled guilt weapon, but the terrifying realization was that I felt no anger, only deep cold pity for my mother, who had spent the holiday manufacturing weapons of emotional coercion instead of existing in the present. Valerie also screenshotted the relatives' responses, which were brutal. My father's cousin suggested my mother might benefit from an objective self-evaluation. Another aunt mentioned my absence was suspicious, and another cousin pointed out that Serena's family seemed more than capable of providing the required familial inclusion. My mother ceased all digital communication. A few days later, Valerie reported that my mother was in an advanced state of distress, having expected a wave of collective outrage directed at me. But instead she was being subjected to objective questioning about the 15-year exclusion protocol. The first week of the new month arrived, and Lars called. For a split second I hoped for a true apology, but instead he inquired if I was genuinely committed to boycotting the winter solstice, stating Mother was experiencing a catastrophic emotional failure, and suggesting I could simply feign normalcy for a single day to revert to the baseline. I informed Lars that my performance of pretense was permanently suspended. I had spent 15 years pretending the surgical exclusion induced profound existential pain, and I would not waste another single unit of time pretending their conduct was anything but a gross failure of empathy. Lars immediately labeled me as self-absorbed, accused me of unnecessarily escalating the situation, and insisted I had a moral duty to assume the role of the bigger person because Mother was structurally collapsing. I terminated the connection, finally understanding that Lars would never perceive me as anything but the problem. I texted Serena the raw data of the call, and she responded instantaneously, stating their loss was a cosmic windfall for her, and she had already initiated the final, decisive planning of a winter solstice designed for my specific existence. A few days later, Serena arrived to commence the official winter solstice shopping operation. We drove toward the colossal anonymous mall, with Zane, a manic blur of teenage energy, vibrating in the passenger seat, detailing the hyper-specific, utterly inappropriate gift he intended to procure for Greg. We infiltrated the subatomic entertainment sector, and as Serena and I were engaged in a low-volume laughter session about an anthropomorphic nightmare toy, Zane suddenly grabbed my wrist and pointed across the aisle. My mother was positioned near a payment terminal, clutching a bag of expensive air. Our eyes locked, and I watched her perfectly calibrated expression shatter, a brief, terrifying moment of raw human response. For a split second, I thought my mother might try to talk, but instead her head snapped around and she instantly bolted toward the most distant exit of the store. I watched her disappear into the crowd, feeling a strangely cold, hollow compression in my chest. Serena gently stabilized me by putting a hand on my shoulder, not saying a word. Zane, bewildered, tugged on my sleeve and asked, "Why did Matriarch walk away with such velocity?" My mind couldn't come up with a quick, child-safe lie, so Serena immediately dropped to his level. "Zane," she stated in a low, steady drone, "adult entities sometimes enter into a state of controlled, mutual disagreement and require spatial separation. This is acceptable." Zane tilted his head and asked if Matriarch was in a state of hyper-aggression toward me. Serena replied that adult emotions are complex, but their volatility would never corrupt the unshakable love they had for him. Satisfied with the technical explanation, Zane returned to his inventory search, though a new subtle confusion seemed to cloud his fierce gaze. We moved to a different area, and Serena linked her arm securely through mine, informing me that my mother's loss was actually a win for us, and she appreciated my unrestricted commitment. We then engaged in a mandatory ritual of hat testing in an accessory store, documenting our collective absurdity in the reflective surface of a display case. Zane in a colossal floppy sun hat, Serena in a ridiculous ear-flapped winter garment, and me in a sequined, aggressively sparkly beret, which successfully purged the residual psychic contamination from the encounter. We transitioned to the food court for high-density cocoa delivery systems topped with enormous destabilizing peaks of whipped cream. Zane managed to apply chocolate to his nose, which Serena immediately corrected with a paper product. This, I realized, was the only viable approximation of the family unit. No one was checking social media or executing clandestine maneuvers. We were just existing together. Serena and I shared a giant salted carbohydrate loop, while Zane provided a long, highly detailed monologue about the structural weaknesses of the early Roman arch. 2 hours later, my feet were killing me, but I didn't want the mission to end. I bought Serena a luxurious sapphire-colored neck-wrapping material that matched her intense eyes. And for Greg, I found a specialized high-frequency sonic lure kit he'd mentioned wanting months prior. For Zane, I obtained a complete archival-grade art production system, and I also acquired a powerful multi-wicked candle set for Valerie and Max to thank them for their critical support. Serena tried to peek into my acquisition bags, but I fended her off, warning her against premature data retrieval. We passed a jewelry store, and Zane pressed his face against the glass, fixated on the sparkling objects. Serena and I exchanged a look, and we entered. I authorized Zane to select a simple, industrial-grade silver bracelet with a heart-shaped metallic token. The clerk packaged it up, and Zane carried the small vessel with the reverence of a newly discovered artifact. On the way home, Zane fell asleep in the back seat, clutching his cargo. Serena reached over and enclosed my hand in hers, stating, with the tone of a high military commendation, that she was proud of my controlled deployment of grace during the encounter with my mother. I didn't feel graceful, but I appreciated the recognition of my operational integrity. 3 days before the winter solstice, my phone buzzed with a text from Caleb, Dana's husband. After a full 60-second analysis of his name, I opened the transmission. He stated he felt a profound sense of retroactive regret for his inaction over the years, admitting he was always aware of the exclusion's inherent wrongness, but his desire to avoid systemic disharmony compelled his silence. He concluded by deeply regretting his sustained state of passivity. I read the message 3 times. My dominant response was not anger, but a vast, crushing weariness. I replied that I appreciated the formal apology, but his silence had functioned as a form of active complicity, that to observe an injustice and refrain from intervention was itself a calculated choice. He responded immediately, accepting the analysis and acknowledging that he understood if I chose to sever all future relational ties, but he simply required me to know that he now possessed the objective truth. I put down the phone and initiated no further contact. It was a marginal input that failed to overwrite the 15 years of absolute silence. The winter solstice eve at Serena's house was an olfactory siege of cinnamon and hyper-refined sugar. Zane immediately shanghaied me into the kitchen, where we spent the afternoon cutting out bizarre, non-Euclidean shapes from a vast, terrifying expanse of dough and decorating them with violently colored synthetic compounds. Greg initiated a controlled thermal event in the living room hearth, rendering the entire dwelling a beacon of heat. Serena initiated the ceremonial preparation of her mother's ancestor rolls, a terrifyingly complex cinnamon pastry, guiding my hands through the delicate dough compression while narrating the recipe's complex sentimental history. We watched old Christmas movies while Zane, with rigid scientific focus, prepared a highly advanced from-scratch cocoa delivery system. I secured a defensive position on the couch with a heavy textile barrier immediately annexed by Zane. The television displayed an ancient narrative, but my attention was diverted by the intense feeling of being functionally operational within a stable unit. Around 10 p.m., Zane began exhibiting signs of system failure, yawning, and Serena commanded his assent for the mandated dental hygiene ritual. I participated in the kitchen's post-processing cleanup, and Serena executed a tight, powerful embrace before I ascended to the guest room, which she now referred to as Victor's primary sector, decorated with photographic evidence from the South Pacific Atoll mission. I entered a state of profound, unprecedented equilibrium. Winter solstice morning began at 7 a.m. when Zane breached my room, employing rapid, rhythmic impacts upon the bed while clad in a hyper-visible, reindeer-themed sleep suit. Downstairs, Greg had already initiated the coffee synthesis, and Serena was extracting the ancestor rolls, which provided a visceral, overwhelming attack on the senses. We consumed the initial sustenance first, despite Zane's near-catatonic fixation on the gift cache under the massive, aggressively decorated central tree. Finally, we initiated the gift exchange protocol, a slow, deliberate process requiring mandatory active observation of the recipient. Zane acquired the archival-grade art system first, emitting a shriek of pure, high-frequency excitement. When Serena opened the massive, bound photographic archive I had created from the Pacific mission, she began to cry with an unexpected intensity, analyzing the images and reading the small clinical annotations I had affixed, which similarly destabilized Greg. Zane was delighted by the silver bracelet and immediately secured it to his wrist. I acquired a soft, oversized sweater from Serena, and a new tactical carry-all from Zane. Then Greg presented me with a customized, specialized fishing apparatus, the handle meticulously engraved with my name, stating he expected its frequent, consistent deployment. The gesture was a formal contract of future engagement, a binding promise of my permanent integration into his routine. I embraced him, allowing the sudden, hot weakness of tears to surface, realizing this was the entity I recognized as my family. I was finally home. Around noon, Valerie and Max arrived with their children, carrying vast aromatic platters of food, and Valerie executed a tight private hug, whispering that she was pleased I was situated in my correct domestic context. The house rapidly achieved critical mass, with Valerie depositing a colossal pan of processed green bean casserole, and Max transferring a smoked avian centerpiece he had prepared himself. Serena assigned specific logistical tasks to every unit, and the kitchen became a highly organized, controlled explosion of activity. We gathered around the dining table, a densely packed, fully operational unit of people who had actively chosen to be here with no deliberate omission. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and shared memories. Zane, seated next to me, maintained a consistent, low-level food transfer operation, insisting I sample every item in the inventory. My phone remained in my pocket, completely silent. I performed one quick visual confirmation during the dessert phase. Absolute zero. No tactical communication from my mother or father. No generic sentiment from Dana or Lars. Not even the requisite low-effort seasonal acknowledgement. The empty screen registered as a sharp, momentary pang of pain, but then I returned my gaze to the table filled with the presence of people who had chosen me. The realization settled into my core, cold, heavy, and possessing the undeniable clarity of a mathematical proof. They were more invested in the validation of their flawed narrative than the maintenance of a relationship. The silence of the device was the final, definitive affidavit of my standing within the core ascendancy. After the meal, Serena pulled me aside and presented me with a small, wrapped container. Inside was a single, silver key attached to a simple metal ring. Tucked beneath the key was a small, folded piece of paper in Serena's distinctive script. "This is your permanent point of origin. Always." I looked up at her, my vision blurring, and finally allowed the internal structure to collapse. The tears came, not the tears of sadness, but the violent cathartic purging of years of accumulated psychic pressure from the systematic exclusion, the performance of excuses, and the crushing continuous interrogation of my own self-worth. All of it was released as Serena held me, providing a slow, constant rub to my back, whispering that I was her son in every metric that mattered, and this dwelling was my sanctioned haven. I wept harder, realizing I had spent my entire life attempting to earn this singular validation. When the emotional storm subsided, I felt a profound structural lightness. The 15-year weight was gone. Serena wiped the residue from my face with her sleeve, and we rejoined the assembly. No one inquired about the visible signs of my emotional purge. They simply created a space for me on the couch and provided a cup of hot, restorative liquid. A week later, Serena executed a New Year's Eve protocol, issuing invitations to her entire social network. The house filled with new, unknown human units, and one after another, people introduced themselves, casually referring to me as Serena's second son, and possessed a detailed, accurate chronological file on my life. The 8-hour drive for the graduation, the Sunday meals, the fishing apparatus from Greg. These individuals had been passively consuming my life narrative for years, completely outside my awareness, and the realization arrived with the force of a tidal wave. My belonging was not a recent acquisition purchased with a large bonus. Serena had been performing the function of familial claim to her entire social graph this entire time, and I had been her son in her internal architecture for years. Greg found me standing in a corner, processing the overwhelming data, and when I informed him I had just achieved the full realization of my existing familial context, he smiled and said, "We were simply waiting for your cognitive processes to catch up." As the chronological apex approached, we executed the collective countdown and released a unified celebratory noise, and Serena raised her glass. To the eradication of the past and to the future of the family. We drank and embraced. Greg joked that I was now permanently attached to their system, regardless of my personal preference, and I confirmed that my captivity had never been more satisfying. The party terminated around 2 a.m., and I assisted with the initial cleanup phase while Zain spontaneously shut down on the sofa. I drove back to my primary sector, feeling a sense of overwhelming structural fullness. In the first week of the new year, a thin, formal paper document arrived from my parents' legal counsel. My hand shook as I opened the envelope, braced for a final hostile attack. But instead, it was sterile, cold business paperwork regarding a financial trust established by my grandmother years ago. A masterpiece of detached professionalism, requesting my final authorization signature for asset distribution. The sheer, calculated absence of emotionality was a more devastating final blow than any angry attack, confirming their complete divestment. I was merely a legal obligation, requiring final processing before our paths diverged forever. I placed the document on my counter and initiated a search for specialized legal counsel, locating an attorney specializing in complex familial trust dissolution, and secured an audience for the following week. Serena immediately volunteered to accompany me to the negotiations, but a new hard determination surfaced within me, and I told her I could manage the task alone. The meeting with the attorney was predictable and sterile. I signed the documents and authorized him to manage all future communication with my parents' legal unit. Over the following weeks, the legal process moved with frightening efficiency. My parents offered no resistance, and the final resolution was seamless, reasonable, and utterly devoid of drama. The absence of conflict felt worse than conflict itself, as they processed me like a commercial transaction and moved on. In late January, I engaged the services of a psychological analyst, not because of functional collapse, but due to a deliberate, surgical need to understand the mechanism of my injury and ensure I did not propagate this toxic familial pattern in my future relational architecture. I provided the full chronological history, and she explained that my decision to invest in Serena was an act of radical self-preservation, and that my parents' chronic destructive behavior was a complete statement about their internal flaw, holding zero relevance to my own self-worth. Over the next few cycles, I began to process the trauma in a healthy, controlled manner, rather than engaging in my chronic suppression. The day of commercialized affection arrived, and Zain appeared at my apartment carrying a gigantic handcrafted card, a chaotic collage of glitter and crude drawings with the inscription, "Greatest Brother Unit Ever." I embraced him, returning the declaration of affection, and affixed the card to my refrigerator next to the South Pacific Mission photographs, receiving a visual affirmation of functional reality every time I passed the appliance. A week after the holiday, Serena initiated a call, proposing a specialized two-person mission to transport me to the dilapidated, forgotten town where she and my father had been raised, a surgical attempt to retrieve the untainted historical record of our lineage before the toxic corruption began. We spent an evening reviewing sepia-toned images, and I secured reservations at a quaint, privately owned sleep and feed facility for an extended weekend in the spring. In the spring, Mr. Thorne summoned me to his private office and announced my elevation to senior analyst, with complete increase in my remuneration package. The first number I dialed was Serena's. Her celebratory shriek was so intense I had to momentarily disengage the handset. That night, Serena, Greg, and Zain escorted me to an expensive downtown Italian establishment where Greg ordered a vintage imported liquid and stood to execute a toast, announcing to nearby patrons that his newly promoted son was a testament to cold, hard effort. 2 days later, Dana transmitted a text, "Congratulations," as if the preceding 6 months of existential warfare had never occurred. The message was short, generic, and suitable for a casual, distant acquaintance. I closed the message and activated the notification deletion protocol. Some relational contracts require a final termination. 6 months after the South Pacific mission, I sat on Serena's rear decking, observing Zane's chaotic, uncoordinated attempt at performing a high-speed cartwheel in the yard. My phone remained silent in my pocket, a quiet trophy of my victory. The people who mattered were occupying the space directly adjacent to me. Serena, Greg, and Zane perform a consistent high-level function in my life. They celebrate my victories, provide support during failures, and never require me to question my utility. My life now possesses a sense of structural permanence that was absent during my pursuit of validation from my biological antecedents. Familial connection is not a function of DNA, debt, or a shared name. It is defined by the unit willing to provide consistent affection, the one that remains present during crisis, and the one that allocates space at the table without the necessity of a formal request. I have finally understood the only viable metric for human connection, and my internal equilibrium has never been higher. So, that's the end of my story. Or, really, the end of my past. Seeing that silent phone on Christmas Day was a moment of cold, hard truth. But looking back at that table full of people who chose me, that's what family really is. It's not about DNA. It's about who shows up. I'm finally home, and I wouldn't trade that for any family trip in the world. Thank you so much for watching and being here. If any part of this resonated with you, if you found your own chosen family, or had to walk away from people who didn't value you, I need you to tell me about it. Leave a comment below sharing your journey to finding peace. Like this video to help share this message of hope, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of my new life. See you next time.